Chapter 28, the Civil Rights Movement. Section 3, Rights for Other Americans. We're going to start talking about Hispanic Americans. And we'll start by saying that the Hispanic population of the United States grew to 4 million people by 1960 and more than 10 million by 1970. But they came from all different places. For example, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and other Latin American countries. And the success of the African American movement, if you will, encouraged Hispanic Americans to fight for their own rights. Cesar Chavez, who you see pictured here, was one of many Hispanic Americans who helped to work to improve the conditions for Hispanic Americans. In 1962, Chavez formed the United Farm Workers. It was kind of a union committed to the goal of better pay and working conditions for migrant farm workers. Migrant farm workers are people who move from farm to farm. They don't settle in one place. Chavez led the union in a 5-year strike and boycott against California grapes and the grape growers. The workers finally won better wages and benefits in 1970. He followed kind of Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolent protest, and he kind of did that. Kennedy ended discrimination based on gender in civil service jobs, and Congress passed the Equal Pay Act. In 1968, Shirley Chisholm became the first African American to be elected into the U.S. House of Representatives. A constitutional amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, was proposed, which would outlaw all discrimination based on sex. The ERA was passed by Congress in 1972. However, it needed 38 states to be ratified, and it fell 3 states short. There will be changes for Asian Americans as well as Italian Americans during this time period as well. Native Americans also had issues. One of their major issues was the lack of control over their tribal lands. Organizations were created to help try to control reservation lands from federal government. They helped to win passage of the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968. Some young Native Americans formed a group called the American Indian Movement to fight for Indian rights, and this group led an occupation of the old federal prison called Alcatraz to protest the government's takeover of Native American lands. AIM, as the organization was called, seized a trading post on Wounded Knee, South Dakota, the site of the massacre many years before, in February 1973. They seized the trading post and a church. It was the site of the U.S. Army's massacre. We talked about that. Federal marshals surrounded Wounded Knee, and a standoff occurs where a gun battle kind of ensues, and it killed 2 protesters and wounded a federal agent. After this protest, as well as some other protests, Congress eventually passed laws giving Native Americans greater self-government on tribal lands. Finally, we come to people with disabilities. In 1970, a woman named Judy Heumann and other activists created a group called Disabled in Action to make people aware of challenges facing people with disabilities. People with disabilities often lacked access to both job opportunities as well as getting just into buildings in public places. So their work actually led to new laws being passed, like the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which discriminated or banned discrimination against people with disabilities. The Education of Handicapped Children Act, which requires schools to provide quality education to children with disabilities. And finally, in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act outlawed all discrimination against people with disabilities. That ends section 4, or 3, excuse me, section 3.